everyone, welcome back. If you're here again, my name is Eli Hernandez, or if you're here for the first time, thank you for being on here for whether that's on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I'm excited that you're here. And today I'm going to continue a little bit on Timothy, the letters of Timothy. And today I want to share with you a heart posture, an attitude of the heart, a lifestyle that that Paul encouraged Timothy to hold on to and to practice, and that I feel, especially now in the days that we're living in, I want to take that, something that the Bible teaches us about, and that has a lot to do with the inheritance of the faith that we've been given and the people who have taught us in the faith. And so I'm excited for today. Why don't you grab your favorite drink, whatever that is, your cup of tea, your cup of coffee, your water, whatever that may be, and we're going to get started. Okay, so as I shared with you the last podcast, I have been in the letters of Timothy, Paul's letters to Timothy, and they have really been impacting my life, and just studying it and reading it over. So many things that I get convicted on. And in today's episode, it's a lot more practical because it's a heart posture, a heart attitude, a lifestyle. It's all of the above when it comes to the people that have taught us in the faith. Nowadays, we live in a time where it's popular to dishonor the older generation. It's part of the culture. It's part of our attitudes and our heart posture against the older generation, where we feel we can do things better. We can disregard everything that you have taught us. And it's a heart posture. It's in the way that we speak towards them, the way we speak about them, elders, authorities, even our own parents. And that's something that the Apostle Paul even told Timothy. He told him in 2 Timothy chapter 3, says there's coming a day, he was saying, in the last days, there's coming a generation. And he said this, in the last days, there will come times of difficulty. And what is the difficulty? He said in verse 2, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money. They're going to be proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. So Paul begins to describe a generation in the last days, and we can see that even throughout Paul's other writings, or even in Peter, or even Jesus in Matthew 24, Luke 21, when he's describing the generation right before he comes back. There is a lot of attitudes and heart postures of a generation. When I mean a generation, it's not just young people. Generations usually is like a span between 100 years. So from the youngest to the eldest, in that 100-year span, all of that is a generation. And he's saying there's going to be this heart posture, this heart attitude against God, against even, and everything having to do outside of God. There will be lovers of money, lovers of pleasure, ungrateful, slanderous. And he adds in disobedient to parents. They're going to be unloving people. And this describes that generation. And we can see some fragments of that in the generation that we live in today. And if we're honest, even in sometimes the greatest temptations of our flesh, to be lovers of ourselves, to love money, to pursue pleasures, to be irreverent towards people, to be slanderous and gossip about people, like that's in our flesh. But there's coming a day where a generation is going to applaud that and celebrate that. And it's going to say, that's amazing. That's great. You're living it out to your fullness. That's really who you are. And we're living in times where we celebrate dishonor towards the generation before us. It's so easy for us to slander the people that are older, people that deserve honor and respect as young people, as young adults. There is constantly this narrative in our lives, in social media, in society, that says that's not a bad thing. Actually, your parents don't know anything, or older people don't know anything. They grew up in a different time. You grew up in a different time. It's okay to do whatever you want to do. And it's okay to not follow in the footsteps of blah, 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 blah. And we even see that inside the church. What we're seeing nowadays is this deconstruction, where people are deconstructing theology, deconstructing doctrine, and saying, well, the ways that I grew up are not actually the ways of God, or the way that I was raised in the faith is actually not that. And now this is what I believe in, or I don't even believe in God or in Jesus anymore because of this and this and this. And so constantly there is this even this rise of narrative of saying, I don't want to live the faith of my parents. I don't want to follow the footsteps of, maybe we didn't have maybe you didn't have believing parents or parents that loved Jesus, but maybe I don't believe the people that discipled me or the person that taught me about the faith and taught me about Jesus. I don't believe that anymore. I believe now this, and now it's a different kind of faith. And now it involves mysticism and speculations and what I want and, all of these things nowadays. And now there are so many different diluted messages of who God is and who Jesus is and what I believe. And so it's just so interesting that in the midst of all the pressures that Timothy was living in, that we talked about in the last episode, Paul telling Timothy, this is the generation that's about to come. Paul understands, obviously he spent a lot of time with Timothy, and he understood Timothy's life. Actually, in 2 Timothy chapter 1, he tells us a little bit about Timothy as he's writing to Timothy. He says in verse 5, I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. So Timothy grew up with his grandmother and mother teaching him about the faith. And maybe you, or for example, in my life, I had my parents, but maybe some of us are like, well, I didn't have family members that taught me about Jesus or showed me the ways of Jesus. Maybe you're the first believer in your family. Actually, the person who taught you was somebody that had nothing to do with you. Like they're not related to you whatsoever, but that's a spiritual mother or a spiritual father. They took that place where they gave you an inheritance of faith. They sowed the seed of the word of God in your life. And that's why you love the Lord now. That's why you're even hearing this podcast today, because of those people. And so I want you to look back and think about the handful of people. For some of us, it's a handful of people. For some of us, it's 1 or 2, 3 people that have impacted you in the faith, discipled you, taught you how to pray, taught you the fear of God. Again, for me, it was my parents. I was fortunate enough that when I was born, my parents were already committed, sincere believers to Jesus. So they taught me what it meant to read the Bible, what it meant, what was the fear of the Lord. I had leaders in my life that invested time, that sat with me, that corrected me, taught me how to pray, taught me how to study the Bible. My dad was the one who would invest in giving me my first Bible. He then gave me a Bible dictionary and was encouraging me to make my own teachings. And I had leaders as well that encouraged me in how to pray, how to sing. They taught me how to worship. They taught me so many different things. And I look back at these people, a handful of people in my life, and I'm like so grateful for their lives. And in a generation that wants to disregard and dishonor and forget, Paul actually tells Timothy, remember them. And he tells them, actually, you're going to walk in the opposite spirit of the generation that wants to dishonor and disregard and slander and be irreverent and talk bad about the previous generation. Paul is telling Timothy, in other words, like, you're going to have a different heart attitude and a heart posture than the generation that's going to be haters of God and lovers of pleasure and lovers of self. You're going to walk in the opposite spirit. You're going to love God. You're going to have a love for God that is even greater than money. You're not going to be disobedient to parents. You're going to honor your parents. You're going to honor the fathers and mothers of the faith that have invested, discipled you, have prayed with you, have labored with you so that you can walk in your destiny in God. And I just want to encourage you today. Remember those people and even thank those people. And I want to encourage you today, if you're a mom, if you're a grandma, if you're a dad, if you're a grandpa, if you're an aunt or an uncle, whatever stage of life that you're in, don't minimize your role. Timothy's mom and grandmother really had an important role in his life. They were able to impart the greatest thing, the most eternal thing that Timothy could ever have, a generation or anybody can ever have, and that's faith in Jesus. That's the word, a love for God, a fear of God. And so I want to encourage you, if you're a mom, even if you're a grandma, don't neglect your role as somebody that can impart the fear of God and a love of God into the next generation, into your children, into your grandchildren. Obviously, I'm not even a mother yet. I'm not even close to being a grandmother yet. But I think about the day that if I am willing to be that, or if the Lord grants me to be that, more than I am willing, if the Lord grants me to be that, one day I want to take that role seriously and give my children and my grandchildren something that is eternal. Nowadays, I have nephews, and I feel that responsibility. They're little. They're 1 year old, and the other one is 3 years old, but I feel this responsibility in my heart. I'm going to pray for them. I'm going to teach them as much as I can about Jesus. I'm going to model to them what it means to love God and to live your life for God. And so I want to encourage you today to, first of all, don't minimize your role, that your role is so key and it's so vital and it's so needed. His mother and his grandmother imparted what they had and were living day to day in their lives. And thank God for Timothy's grandma and Timothy's mom that imparted their faith into Timothy. And we Think of heroes of the faith. We think of Daniel. Daniel was a young man. And I've heard said a lot of times, who were Daniel's parents? That Daniel, as a young man, was able to stand firm in the midst of pressure, in the midst of living in Babylon, in the midst of living in a social system, religious system that was outright against God, that they were completely against God. And he was able to stand firm even in the midst of all of that, with a love for God and a love for truth. Who were his parents? His parents must have done something right to raise Daniel and teach Daniel in the fear of the Lord and the love for the Lord. So my encouragement to you is, don't minimize your role. Impart your faith to those around you, as a mom, as a dad, as an aunt, as an uncle. If you're a young person and you're like, well, I'm not even close to being a mom, not even close to being a grandma, but maybe you have nephews and nieces, or maybe you're really close to friends who do have children, or you're serving in Sunday school. Those are children. Those are the next generation that need spiritual mothers and fathers. And this is another one. Even for people who say, well, I don't have children, or even for people that have said, well, I grew up not having a believing mom or a believing dad, but the person who impacted me the most was my youth pastor, or was the random person on the bus that preached to me about Jesus. So this is my encouragement to you. Even if they're not biologically yours, you can be a spiritual mother, a spiritual father. And all that means is somebody that can impart, that can influence a younger generation to love Jesus and believe Jesus. And so don't minimize your role. Whatever place that you're in, we're called to be mothers and fathers to a generation, whether that be they're related to us, or whether that be in a spiritual sense of discipling a younger generation and giving to them something that's eternal, that's goals, which is faith and love in Jesus, love for the word. And my second encouragement to you today is, as young people, and even if you're not young, if you're a little bit older, it's, let us walk with a heart posture of honor. Let us walk in the opposite spirit of what Satan is trying to stir in people and in a generation, to walk irreverent, to walk in dishonor, and in walking in disregarding the older generation and the generation before us. I want to encourage us, and this is where I feel convicted about. I want to walk in the opposite spirit than what the enemy wants to awaken in a generation. I want to do the complete opposite. I'm going to bless my mother and my father. I'm going to bless the older generation. I'm going to remember the handful of people that invested in my life, and I'm going to tell them, thank you. Thank you for paying the price. Thank you for praying for me. Thank you for discipling me. Thank you to my parents for praying for me and putting up with me when I didn't want to go to church and I didn't want anything to do with Jesus. Thank you, because you gave me an inheritance. And that doesn't mean that they're perfect. Nobody's perfect. And that doesn't mean imitate even their bad things or their bad decisions. I'm not saying that. Yes, there are things that we can grow from. Yes, there are things that we can grow and learn from their mistakes and weaknesses. Nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm sure I'm going to make a lot of mistakes with the people that I lead, my children, because I'm not perfect. I'm weak and I'm broken. But I want to transmit the eternal. And so the same way that my parents imparted to me something that's eternal, leaders, these key people in my life, the handful of people that I can name, and I've told them, thank you for what you've taught me. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for discipling me. They were weak and broken people too. But that doesn't mean I can't honor them and I can't thank them for that. Actually, and with this, I'll end this podcast. In the next chapter, Paul tells Timothy this. In chapter 3 of 2 Timothy, Paul tells Timothy, "But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise." So he says, remember the people who taught you. Remember that you grew up with the sacred writings since childhood. And again, some of us grew up since little children because of believing parents or believing family members or people that were like a family to us, that taught us the way of the Lord, that taught us the scripture. And maybe for some of us, that's when we were just teenagers, or maybe just a couple of years ago, somebody taught us in the faith. But Paul is telling them, remember from whom you learned it from. In the midst of people trying to deconstruct theology, in the midst of people trying to make up their own theology and make up their own gospel, Paul is telling them, remember those people that taught you. See how they lived their lives. They loved God. They loved the word. They're not perfect. They're broken. They made a lot of mistakes, but they love God and they're pursuing God even in their weakness and even in their brokenness. There's still something that you can value of what you've learned from them, of what you grew up in. And so that's what Paul is in other words telling Timothy, remember those people. There's something that in their lives have given a testimony of their love for the Lord. And they're weak, they're broken, yes, they're not perfect, totally not. They have limitations for sure. They've made mistakes completely, yes, and so will we. But he's saying, remember from whom you've learned it from. These are people that have a testimony with the Lord. These are people that have given their lives. They've paid a price to love Jesus, to follow Jesus. And they paid a price to invest in you too. And so I look back at those people and I want to say thank you. And so my encouragement to you today is tell them thank you. Send them a text message. Or if you see them in person, tell them, hey, thank you for investing in me. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for in depositing faith, giving me faith in Jesus, teaching me how to love God and how to be faithful. And at the same time, don't minimize your role to do that with the next generation. If you're a mother, grandmother, be a spiritual mother, be a spiritual father, impart that to the next generation. And don't minimize your role of how you can impart love for Jesus in another generation and inspire a generation to love God more. And so I just want to encourage us in that. Let's walk in the opposite spirit that this generation is walking towards. And let's hold fast to what the Lord tells us with a heart posture of honor. And we want to bless them. And so I just want to encourage you to make those practical steps. Send them a text. Tell them, hey, thank you. Thank you so much. And walk it out, impart to the next generation. And so I hope this blesses you, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you so much for being here.